Okay, well, welcome to our latest episode of Guardians of the Flame. And this is one of the series, this new season that we're doing, where a bunch of these podcasts we're able to film, which is great. So you're able to kind of look in and see our conversation. We're really grateful for the Community Relations Council, which has helped to kind of fund this season. It's a real joy, this adventure of producing interviews with people that have something to say about the world we live in, about conflict, about their experience, and sometimes how faith can intersect with all of those parts of life and humanity and conflict, and how faith can sometimes be something that can be destructive, but how it can also be something very life-giving. I want to introduce, this is the first time I've introduced someone who is actually a family member of mine. I'll just tell a quick story as my part of introducing Bruce Clark. A few years ago, I was on Twitter looking at a Northern Irish journalist, William Crawley, who was doing a series on people from the north of Ireland here who had emigrated to New Zealand. And I wrote to him and said, well, my forebears were from Ulster, from Northern Ireland. And he said, are you any relation to Bruce Clark? And then I said, well, I do have relatives in Upperlands, this small village, kind of halfway between Belfast and Londonderry. And so he gave me Bruce's details. I found him, and we are indeed, we call each other cousins. Kind of not exactly that, but our great-grandparents were friends, and well, they were brothers, so we might touch a little bit on that as we start there. So Bruce has had 4 decades of experience as a foreign correspondent. He's worked for Reuters, the Financial Times, the Times of London, and indeed the Economist, where he writes now regularly. And so Bruce has had an experience of kind of writing about the world, and particularly Europe, during these decades where we've seen the fall of the Soviet Union, kind of great changes particularly in the former Soviet Union, places like former Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars. He's written several books. He has great expertise on Greece and Russia and that whole area. He's a linguist, speaks a number of languages, and so it was a pleasure to meet a relative of mine who is so intelligent and such a good, kind guy. So it's a real privilege, Bruce, to be able to sit with you and have a conversation on film. We usually have a chat about once a week, and every time I'm kind of thinking I wish we could record this because you say stuff that's just quite brilliant. So thanks, Bruce, for taking the time.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I must say, by Irish standards, we're certainly cousins. We're third cousins, I think, which is really quite close in Irish terms. So, and as you say, our my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather were brothers. So that's close enough.
Yeah. So if you'll forgive us as we start this interview, I kind of would like to do just a short kind of homage to the Clark family, or not an homage, but a little bit of digging into, I suppose, what our common background is, because it is interesting. Could you kind of just sketch out the village of Upperlands, the Clark family, and a little bit of our history, and then I might ask you a little about my own great-great-grandfather.
Yes. Well, the Clark family is an unusual survival in a way, because in one way or another, the Clarks have been involved with processing and making linen for, by my calculation, 9 generations. And that all began sort of sometime in the mid-18th century when our common forebear found a place that was suitable to drive a water wheel, a stretch of the river that would just be of the right gradient and the right flow of water to drive a wheel. And he harnessed that wheel to a beetling engine, which was a very particular stage in the linen process. It's a process whereby linen is battered with wooden blocks and made shinier and flatter. And thanks to the mechanization of that process, linen became an industry, and not just a craft, but an industry. And you might say the rest is history. There have been a succession of linen booms in Northern Irish history. One was in the 18th century, very much linked with migration to the United States and the trade with North America. And then a second linen boom in the 19th century, early 20th century even, and the Clark family, in a modest way, was part of that boom. Maybe just as well in a modest way. It wasn't quite like the great linen families of Belfast. It was always rooted in the soil, and agriculture was never far away. And so after those booms, it didn't crash so dramatically as some of the linen families did in Belfast. It somehow trundled on, and I'm glad to say that the business does still trundle on a smaller scale, but it's still engaged in processing linen cloth and producing very high quality interior decoration fabrics and so on. So in one way or another, it is ploughing ahead towards its 300th anniversary.
Wow, that's amazing. And the Clark family itself, we're kind of scattered around the world, and of course my branch went to New Zealand. I did find it fascinating, and if my siblings listen to this interview, they'll find it fascinating just to hear some of what you've about it was my great grandfather. William Clark.
That's right, indeed.
Became known as New Zealand Willie.
Yeah, indeed.
He moved out to New Zealand. What can you tell me about my great grandfather? This is like one of those episodes.
Indeed, absolutely.
Where are you from?
Yes. Well, I mean, picture the family that your forebear and my forebear were born into. They were brought up in quite a grand house called Appertain, newly built in about 1850. And 9 siblings altogether were raised in this house. Their mother was a member of the quite grand Newport family of Waterford. So that the Clark family, who were linen makers, linen processors, had sort of moved up a step socially by marrying into the grand Newports. And they celebrated this by building a rather handsome white Georgian-style mansion called Appertain. And they raised 9 children there. Now, your forebear was the oldest of those children. My forebear was the youngest. Your forebear was William Clark, named after his father, and he was clearly sort of rather spoiled as a child. It was assumed that he would be the one who would go into the business and inherit the business. But fate took a different turn, that very young, he married somebody who was of a different class background. Religion wasn't the problem, but class somehow was. And it was considered advisable that, as my father puts it, the problem be solved by emigration. The couple wed in Manchester Cathedral, and in a quiet wedding there. And they took ship for New Zealand. They were given sort of a roll of linen as good luck, and started, I think, initially a retail business there. They must have had a hardish life in the remotish part of the North Island of New Zealand. But they were extremely fecund. They had 10 children altogether, and as a result of which many people bearing the name of Clark live all over New Zealand, and some of those people have found their way back to Northern Ireland, as you have. But I think it's a sad story in a way, because there was clearly an estrangement between William Clark and his parents and his remaining siblings. Not a total estrangement, because many of his children, those 10 children who grew up in New Zealand, found their way back to Appertain and to Upperlands in wartime. And so the connection was maintained, although the personal story of William Clark was perhaps quite a sad one.
And you told me one little detail which I have used now as a kind of an anecdote, because it's a great story about he and his new bride kind of getting the boat to New Zealand, but they missed the boat. And
that's right. Yes, indeed. Yes. And the boat that they nearly got actually sank. So they had a lucky escape. Fate obviously intended them to survive and to thrive in New Zealand, as all their descendants have done.
So I make the point that if you feel like you've missed the boat, that maybe that was actually there's something.
That's very often the
that.
case. Yes. Yeah. I think that many of us will testify in life that flights we nearly caught, or boats we nearly took, or options we nearly took in life actually turn out to be a narrow escape. That's one of life's truths. Yes.
Yeah. I'd love to kind of start talking more about your career, but maybe even before that is your love of language. You're fluent, among other things, in Russian, in Greek, French. Can you tell us about your early days in, first of all, in Upperlands and then at boarding
Yes,
school?
I mean, I was a bit of an unusual child growing up in a remotish part of Mid-Ulster, because I always had a passion for languages, both ancient and modern. Indeed, if you'd met me when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my most prized possession was a Dutch linguaphone course, which my father had sort of taken a slight interest in learning Dutch because he had Dutch business partners, and he didn't really make much progress, but I grabbed hold of his books and his coursework and so on, and I began teaching myself Dutch solo. And actually, I do have a modest understanding of Dutch, and whenever I go to the Netherlands, it comes back to me quite rapidly. So, I mean, I was a language freak, if you like, from a very young age.
Yeah. Okay, so then you started into a career into what became, these many decades of working as a foreign correspondent. In my teenage years, probably the most kind of iconic moments of that were probably the release of Nelson Mandela from prison and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the ultimate fall of the Soviet Union. You were there at that time, as certainly as Boris Yeltsin took power.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that time of kind of going to Russia? And
indeed, yes.
What was that like to be?
Well, I'll
there?
tell you, sort of, ironically enough, what initially attracted me to learning Russian and being a journalist in Russia was the idea that perhaps it was a mysterious place, but one that didn't change all that much. I remember sort of in the mid-'80s thinking, well, now, the language, it's Indo-European, but it's quite difficult. It's about the right level of challenge for me. And also, I might be suited quite well to a situation like Brezhnev's Russia, which was fairly static, but nonetheless very mysterious. So one could devote a lot of energy to analyzing this opaque slice of reality. Well, of course, by the time I got round to actually being in Russia, it was anything but static. It was changing so fast that it was literally bewildering and at times frightening, but also exhilarating. Also, a sense of living through absolutely extraordinary moments of history. I arrived in Moscow to take up my job there as a foreign correspondent in December '89, which was roughly the time of Sakharov's death, the great dissident Andrei Sakharov. One of my first memories is of watching people queue for hours upon hours in the snow to pay homage to Andrei Sakharov, and then attending his funeral, which also became a kind of political meeting for the then liberal opposition movement. So I really, really had a sense of extraordinary change in the air, because around the same time, Russia's first democratic legislature was meeting. And so in a place which had been completely monolithic, which had accorded to the Communist Party a complete monopoly of power, you suddenly had an extraordinary diversity of views was being expressed. And the mere fact that people were standing up in an official legislature and disagreeing with each other, I mean, that alone was an extraordinarily exhilarating thing to behold.
Because it never happened, hadn't happened for so long. There'd been such a tight control on the
Indeed,
message.
yes.
And a one-party system. What are some recollections of that time, kind of thing, little anecdotal stories that stand out of kind of stories that you did or that you wrote? Or
well, the general atmosphere in Moscow was of a system and of an empire, if you like, that was in very rapid and almost spontaneous disintegration. And I mean, it was both exhilarating and frightening at the same time, because there seemed to be no obvious limit to how far this disintegration could go. And because, I mean, all the discussion in the West was about, is Gorbachev doing a good job? Is Yeltsin doing a good job? Would Yeltsin be better? And so on. But when you were actually inside that situation, you felt that the disintegration was so rapid and so spontaneous that honestly, what this or that leader did, wasn't all that important. I mean, it was. I mean, Gorbachev seemed to me like a man sort of cascading down a mountain, from a very great height. And if he was really skilled, he might be able to sort of slightly tilt the direction of the cascade. But he was managing a process or not managing it, over which ultimately he had very little control. I think that was and so people said, would it be desirable for the Soviet Union to break up? Is it something we should encourage or discourage or whatever? In fact, it was just the process was so rapid and so spontaneous that honestly, what we thought was desirable didn't really come into it that much. That's one of the main lessons. And of course, at an everyday level, in certain ways, when I arrived, it was quite corrupting to be a Westerner in Moscow, because the value of Soviet currency, the ruble, was collapsing, and so if you had even literally a few pounds or a few dollars, you were automatically very, very rich by Soviet standards, and many people in Moscow wanted desperately to have Western friends, frankly because it could mean an air ticket, could mean an invitation to the West, it could mean earning a few dollars or a few pounds, and the average wage at that time amounted in hard currency terms to maybe less than $100 a month. And so, you had the impression of being, well, unhealthily powerful almost as a Westerner. You felt, I hate to say it, a little bit like sort of Gulliver and Lilliput, and and I could sense that this wouldn't last long, and that it would be corrupting for the Western side, and yet that was very much a part of reality for a while. I mean, my time of full-time residence in the Soviet Union was December 92 to December 89 to December 92, 3 full years. I then, in the year of 93, I came back quite a lot. So I returned to Russia in spring 93 after a 3-month absence. And although most of the talk about Russia was about anarchy and chaos and further disintegration, I actually noticed something different in the atmosphere. I felt that through all the disorder, Russia was somehow getting its act together again, and the state was sort of minimally starting to function, albeit badly, and above all, there was a change in the relationship between Russians and Westerners, and this played out in many small situations as well, that Westerners noticed that their Russian friends were no longer so obsequious and no longer so prepared to admire everything Western, and it actually tested some friendships quite badly. But generally, there was a sense in the air that Russia is going to be okay, and it'll need Western help for a while, but not indefinitely. And once it gets back on its feet again, it's going to be self-assertive and not necessarily friendly to the Western powers that did sort of, in a manner of speaking, help or advise with its economic recovery.
So it was, before we go into kind of talking about some of the other kind of journalism that you did, you wrote during, that you worked on during those years, I'd just love to stay on Russia for a little bit, because obviously in the world we live in today, Russia is very much becoming a strong power again. Well, it is a strong power. I grew up in the Cold War 80s, where the kind of was seen as Russia and America were the two superpowers. The fall of the Soviet Union, as you're kind of alluding to, was seen by a teenage Johnny Clark as, well, this is the end of Russia as a big superpower, and they're going to be a small kind of country, small power that will be friendly to the West from now on, because they'll be very grateful to the West, and I think you're kind of alluding to the fact that you saw a lot of that coming. Russia is a fascinating place. Do you have some kind of observations from your time there, and kind of how the Russia that we see today, and Putin's strength, his kind of unchallenged power, his involvement in conflicts around the world, and kind of, and not conflict like he's starting them, but he's certainly proxy wars. It seems like we're kind of going back in time to the 1980s a little bit.
Indeed.
What is it about Russia that kind of I don't know, attracts someone like Putin to emerge? And is there something in it?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that, well, I wouldn't be the first person to say that there was something in the Russian psyche that respected a strong leader and felt that, with such a vast country, only an iron hand can really rule effectively and so on. I used to hear people say that, there's no other way with us. S nami inache nельзя. With us, it's impossible to do it any other way. Нужна железная рука. You need an iron hand to rule us. And I remember people saying that at a time when there wasn't much sign of an iron hand. So I took notice of that, and sure enough, a kind of iron hand has come along. Russia is, back on its feet militarily, and I always felt that conventional wisdom underestimated Russia's ability to reorganize itself militarily. Its capacity in many fields of military strength never entirely went away, and it's able to deploy force across long distance in a way that certainly no West European country can easily do. It's still, the GDP of Russia is still quite small. So it is, the total size of the Russian economy is still, that of a medium to sort of lesser West European state. But it is certainly militarily a player in the world. It's been able to, use force in Syria, by proxy in Libya, in Ukraine, of course. So certainly 20 or 30 years ago, if you had said that we'd be worried more about Russian strength than about Russian weakness, that would have gone against the grain of conventional wisdom. Although, a modest fellow that I am, I think I did always foresee this. I felt that, well, I think what I sensed is that if Russia survived at all, it would regain strength. It seems to me that historically, Russia has been a country that has been always in a state of quite rapid flux between strength and weakness, between sort of disintegration and reintegration, and it's like a tide almost. If you think how Russia was in the 1920s after the revolution, I mean, several years of complete chaos and just utter anarchy, reigning across 11 time zones, and within 2 decades of that, Stalin had built one of the mightiest state behemoths ever created in history. So there's an extraordinary flux, shall we say, and there are various maxims people have pronounced about Russia. One is that Russia is always stronger and weaker than it looks. I mean, in the Soviet days, people used to say contemptuously that the Soviet Union was like Upper Volta with rockets. In other words, it was basically a poor, underdeveloped country with kind of villages with no running water. It just happened to have a lot of nuclear weapons. And it's certainly true that Russia it measures strength in a different way than a conventional West European country would do. Another of the maxims about Russia was by a famous Russian poet, Tyutchev, in the 19th century. He said, "Russia cannot be measured by any human yardstick. In Russia, you can only believe." In other words,
That's brilliant. So I'd love to go on to Georgia. Is one of the Caucasus, this kind of region. You spent time in Azerbaijan, Armenia, but also in Georgia at a time when there was real conflict going on. And again, part of this podcast series is just looking at conflict. And it's not often we've been able to sit down with an actual foreign correspondent who's kind of lived through great change, like in Russia, but also in Georgia. What were some of your memories of that time? I was there a couple of years ago in Tbilisi. A beautiful country.
Indeed, yes.
Beautiful churches. What are your memories of that time, and what was the conflict like, the nature of it?
Well, when I first arrived in Georgia, that was December 89, January 1990, it was still a very, very attractive and pleasant place to be, compared, frankly, with Moscow at that time. It was, there was still food on the table. There was still a sense that sort of, social life, cultural life was intact and even modestly flourishing. There was a lot of sort of trouble in the air, in the sense that, there had been a terrible incident in April '89 when, Soviet troops had killed some demonstrators with a kind of poison gas, and that was that's remembered as a very dark memory by Georgians to this day. So there were dark clouds on the horizon, but nonetheless, Georgia felt like an extraordinarily pleasant and warm and welcoming place to be, compared, frankly, with Moscow at that time, which was a rather bleak and frightening place. And so, over the 3 years that I was visiting Georgia, I saw it slide from that relatively pleasant state into a really appalling and horrific state of civil war and anarchy, much, much worse than anything you saw in Moscow, frankly. Life in Moscow was unpredictable, but what you had, especially after the overthrow of President Gamsakhodia in January 1992, you had a situation where it was dangerous to walk the streets. There were kind of, unshaven young men with Kalashnikovs at every corner, and people didn't know where the next meal was coming from, and just an apparent decline into, complete anomie, complete chaos. And so, and I watched this, and I watched this with great distress, because you can't go to Georgia without making friends, and on every trip to Georgia, I made new friends and kept in touch with them. And I saw how families were personally affected. Some families were divided in the factional fighting. It was just an extraordinary descent from, being a kind of Shangri-La almost, on the surface at least, to being a place of absolute horror. And then I'm glad to say a relative recovery since then.
Yeah. And during that time, you, even in the 90s, you did go to other war zones. What was it like? What's it like to be a correspondent and to be in a place like Georgia or the Albanian-Kosovan border that you went to potentially see refugees fleeing, to hear bombs, perhaps, to see bullets?
Well, yes. I have never been a real war reporter, although I've kind of moved among war reporters. And it so happened that in that week, the first week of January '92, the micro-civil war in Georgia was sort of the war in the world at that moment. And therefore, the entire core of hardened war reporters descended on Tbilisi. And all of them, and I as well, stayed in a kind of surreally luxurious hotel just on the outskirts of the city centre. And we made cautious trips as far as we dared into the city centre. And some of my brave Spanish colleagues actually, penetrated into the bunker underneath Parliament where President Gamsakhodia was holed up. Shells were raining down, and there was a most surreal scene, I remember, where we all foregathered in the hotel in the evening, and some journalists had been in the bunker. These sort of handful of brave Spanish journalists had been in the bunker with the president, and another group of journalists had been with the people who were actually firing the shells from the top of the hill. Wow. So they all showed their footage, and so I got a taste of sort of what it's like to be a hardcore war reporter, and how these people have often an absolute need of the adrenaline that sort of the sound of gunfire or gives you, or the very, very intense emotions that exist in a war situation. I suppose I've had a little taste of that myself. I went to there were kind of sort of small sort of local conflicts going on in South Ossetia in the north of Georgia, and then on a bigger scale in Abkhazia, and I've certainly been on the edge of those conflicts. I've been in I remember sort of staying overnight in a house in South Ossetia with kind of gunfire ranging the whole time, and it brings very, very powerful emotions to the surface, and it means your life goes into slow motion. and people's, as one friend of mine who's a much more serious war correspondent than I said to me, war is a situation where people's true face comes out. People throw off their masks, and you realize, who's a coward, who is a big-hearted person, who's a brave person. It's no longer possible to pretend. So I can see why, for some people, war reporting as such becomes a kind of addiction.
I'd love to talk about a part of the former Soviet Union that kind of perhaps has resonances with here in Northern Ireland. You spent some time in the former Yugoslavia, which then broke up into, is it 7 states?
That's right. Yes, indeed.
Due to the Serbian-Croatian conflict,
absolutely,
and then Bosnia's own wars between the Serbian population and the Muslim population, and Kosovo then becoming...
Yes, we're talking the former communist world, not... Yes, and it's a kind of... Yugoslavia was a sort of mini-Soviet Union in a way, because it was a communist federation.
Oh, right, yes,
And it was very... it was estranged diplomatically from the Soviet Union.
Right, yes.
But Yugoslavia itself had certain power... it had a very, sophisticated, westernized North, Slovenia, sort of a bit like the Baltic states. It had, a relatively poor south, Kosovo, the Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which were maybe, just as the Soviet Union had a sort of, a poorish south. So, in a sense, that communist Yugoslavia was a microcosm of the Soviet Union. And through the 90s, by this time I was working for the Financial Times, I was very much involved in covering the post-Yugoslav conflict. And again, not strictly speaking as a war correspondent, but as a diplomatic correspondent. I was based in London. I used to travel, to diplomatic conferences with them, and I traveled with Douglas Hurd, for example, when he was the British Foreign Secretary, or when he would sometimes travel jointly with his French counterpart, Alain Juppé. And as journalists, we would tag along with that. I was at the Dayton conference in Ohio when the Bosnia War was settled. Wow. So I was very much involved in following Western policy making around Bosnia, and of course that did involve going to Bosnia itself, and to Croatia.
And you were there in Sarajevo itself?
Yeah, look, I was in Sarajevo. No, I can't. No, there were some. I have some very brave colleagues who spent most of the conflict actually in Sarajevo when it was under siege. Now, and I salute them, and I kind of, I edited, and you might say I desked their work. I was following Sarajevo so closely that I might almost have been there, but I don't. I entirely take my hat off to the people who had the courage to stay there the whole time. I went to Sarajevo very shortly after the Dayton Agreement, when it was still quite tense, and the Serb suburbs of Sarajevo were still inhabited by Serb people and the Serb forces and so on. And then I went back quite a lot afterwards. I did a story about the 10th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre. I went to Mostar at a time when it was still very tensely divided between the two sides of the river, Croats on one side, Muslims or Bosniaks on the other. So I've certainly tasted the atmosphere of conflict in Bosnia. And as you say, there are some sort of weird parallels with Northern Ireland, in the sense that you have a country where everybody speaks the same language. They may call it different things, but it is the same language. They even speak it with the same accent. I mean, there is a Bosnian accent which is common to Serbs and Croats and Muslims and so on. To an outsider, the warring parties can be actually quite difficult to tell apart. I mean, it's more obvious what they have in common than what separates them. And yet, those differences were still salient enough for the place to descend. Once the Communist Federation broke up, the place descended into a really horrific war, and a war of terrible ethnic cleansing and torture and horrors that we thought would not be seen in Europe again.
I remember being involved in a course probably nearly 10 years ago, and on it were a number of people from. There were Croatians, there were Serbians, and there was a Bosnian Muslim there, or someone ethnic Muslim background, and we were studying scripture and different things in the Bible, And at one point, I asked. We were in Croatia at the time, actually. I asked the Bosnian to read a passage. I said, "Would you read that in Croatian?" And he said, "I will read it in Bosnian." You know, and
Exactly.
of course, it's exactly the same language. But so here in Northern Ireland, we have a conflict that goes back many years. We look the same. We speak the same language. You've said to me, you know, if you went to the former Yugoslavia in 1985, it would have seemed like those ethnic differences were fading away.
Yes, that's right.
And there was a sense of one big Yugoslavia. And still, when I go to Bosnia pretty much every year for the last 4 or 5 years, and I meet a number of people who sometimes will say they kind of miss Yugoslavia. You know, they wish it could be just that country where we all lived in peace. You know, but somehow it fell apart. You know. And what are your kind of reflections on comparing a place like that to Northern Ireland and ethnic difference, religious difference? Is it part of human nature for us just to always fall apart? Or
well, I suppose communist Yugoslavia, it had the merits and the faults of an authoritarian multinational state. It had a ruling ideology. It had a party, the Communist League, which had the monopoly of power, and it had a powerful. Although it was an attractive and quite prosperous place, and life seemed to be much freer than it did in other parts of Eastern Europe. Nonetheless, I mean, it was a place where people kept an eye on each other, and where people who strongly expressed one nationalist line or another could go to prison. And so some of the people who were protagonists in the war had actually spent time in prison in communist Yugoslavia simply for advocating one national or religious cause or another, not in a violent way, but simply the mere act of strongly advocating the merits and the interests and the historic rights of one particular group was a punishable offence. And that's, of course, outrageous in terms of our understanding of free speech and liberty and so on. But it created a framework, for better or worse, in which people could live together peacefully and quite prosperously. It was unsustainable in the end, to a large, and it was very unsound economically, and to a large extent, communist Yugoslavia was kept going by Western credits. In the final years of communist Yugoslavia, it was a question of pumping more and more money into the federal government to keep the place in existence. And yet it was ultimately an economic basket case, and it had some, quite prosperous parts of Croatia, Slovenia certainly, that were subsidizing the poorer parts. And that whole show could only be kept going by endless Western loans. And at a certain point, rightly or wrongly, the West pulled the plug and said, it's no longer necessary or worthwhile for us to be pumping money into this place. And then, almost spontaneously, multi-party democracy came, and in each constituent republic, nationalist forces came to the fore, and in Serbia you had a particularly kind of toxic concoction of sort of, if you like, nationalism and a sort of imperialism, in the sense that the Serbs felt that they were, they had been the dominant force in the Yugoslav Federation, and they were destined to lose out in the event of a total disintegration. But I guess one of the things that is thought-provoking from a Northern Irish point of view is that the communist Yugoslav system rested on suppressing or channeling, to a large extent, memories of the terrible things that had happened in the Second World War. You were allowed to remember the partisans and the, in a very selective way, a very selective version of Second World War history was told. But individual groups were not allowed to nurse or express their own grievances. And so, for example, in Croatia, there was a terrible concentration camp run by Croats who were pro-Nazi, and this was a place where many Jews and many Serbs were killed. The numbers have been exaggerated, but nonetheless, it was still a terrible place, and a place of which the victims and the bereaved maintain awful memories for decades afterwards, which were not expressed because it wasn't part of the official ideology. And so there was no context in which people could freely share the pain that they suffered in the Second World War. And it might have seemed, if you'd gone there in the 1980s, that was all to the good, in fact, that those dark memories had been successfully exorcised and the country was looking forward. But in fact, once the straitjacket was removed, those memories came flooding back. And it was very easy for nationalist politicians to say, we are now going to avenge all the terrible things that we suffered in the Second World War and we were never allowed to talk about. So in a sense, it's a very bad advertisement for the idea that you can literally forget the past. That the past does have to be remembered, but it has to be, but also remembered in a way that doesn't give any side the monopoly of pain.
Yeah, so I remember being in Bosnia. Well, I've been a number of times, and I've been to a museum in Banja Luka where it kind of commemorates the death of of many Serbs in Croatian kind of concentration camps, if you like, in the Second World War. And so what you're talking about is memory. We could probably go down that line for a long time. But are you saying that, I suppose you're just alluding to the importance of somehow of memory and acknowledging the past. And I think that is, it's not controversial, but it's one of the things that we wrestle with in post-conflict countries, is how do you deal with the past? Do we have endless tribunals or investigations, commissions to kind of go back and find out the truth? But of course, in a country like Northern Ireland, you've got literally thousands of events that happened, and how do you kind of dig it all up? Is there any kind of thoughts that you have, maybe particularly when reflecting on Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, on like how they could have done it well, or how they could have acknowledged it well, how even in Northern Ireland, I know that's not your job to kind of pontificate on how they could have done it better. You're reporting on what they did. But is there any thoughts on that, like how it could have been done in a better way?
Yes. Well, of course, the issue of truth remembrance comes up sort of twice over in the context of Bosnia and the Yugoslav wars. In that, part of the reasons why the war started or why it spread so quickly was because of these, undealt with memories of the Second World War. And then, when the ghastly conflict of the 90s unfolded, there was an exceptionally elaborate judicial process. There was a dedicated tribunal which is sat in The Hague and has heard dozens of cases, and really it's unique in the world, I think, that so much money, so many resources were invested in going over a recent conflict judicially, and dozens of convictions for crimes against humanity and so on. So, I suppose one of the points about that is it's unlikely ever to be repeated. Perhaps because it was happening in Europe, on Europe's doorstep, and really physically quite close to The Hague. Maybe it was felt that this could be an exemplary case of post-conflict justice, but I have to say that it hasn't really had the desired effect of making people think hard about what their side was responsible for. I mean, the majority of people convicted in The Hague have been Serbs. I mean, there have been people of all nationalities, but the Serbs have had the lion's share. And could I say that those convictions and those cases and the evidence heard, has it made people among the Bosnian Serbs and in Serbia itself, has it made them reflect on the bad things that were done in their name? No, I very much fear it hasn't. And on the contrary, the process has fed a kind of victimhood that we're always treated more harshly than anybody else, and why are more of our people being tried than other groups, and I suppose the fact that it was a foreign court from their point of view, the fact that people were kind of arrested and then airlifted to a foreign country, albeit not far away, that unfortunately exacerbated the problem of people refusing to accept the legitimacy of the process and saying it's all weighted against us. And so the trials in The Hague, I mean, they brought great satisfaction from the point of view of the victims, and maybe that had to be, and that was right and proper. But it didn't bring the sort of contrition and self-examination on the part of people who were, in some sense or other, collectively responsible. And so that's made me sort of, in general, a bit skeptical about highly expensive judicial processes as a form of conflict resolution. I mean, I sat in the International Criminal Court in The Hague on the trial of some very powerful Kenyan politician. And I could see it. I mean, this was an immensely expensive process that barristers and judges even were sort of being paid fabulous sums of money. And indeed, the process of bringing witnesses from the heart of Africa to The Hague is all highly, highly expensive. But was it actually doing the job of reconciling people, or making people think harder about what their side might be collectively responsible for? I wasn't completely convinced. It made me, in general, a bit skeptical about sort of expensive and elaborate justice as a way of promoting reconciliation, at least in the absence of other things, including kind of truth discovery and dialogue and a forum in which people can articulate their own pain and without claiming a monopoly of pain. Justice alone just doesn't seem to do it. And
that's very helpful. There's so much we could kind of go down that line. I was just talking in an interview yesterday about this definition of reconciliation as a place, John Paul Lederach's definition, a place where truth, mercy, justice, and peace meet. And what you're alluding to, I suppose, is if reconciliation is simply justice or truth, but there's no kind of desire for dialogue, for some sense of healing, restoration, then it becomes, justice and truth can become almost like a weapon to use against the other side, or a kind of...
Indeed, yes. And I think that in some situations, justice can pull in one direction, reconciliation in another, and truth sometimes in yet another. I'm not even that convinced that justice is all that appropriate a tool for truth discovery, in sense that as the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa showed, I mean, there are situations where truth will come out more easily in conditions of amnesty. So I mean, justice and the threat of draconian punishment can actually, in some circumstances, make it harder to discover truth.
Wow, it's very good. It's such an interesting kind of line of conversation. I've been always very fascinated by South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by the Kikacha courts of Rwanda. They do seem to be examples of a more like what we could call restorative justice than retributive justice. They were about kind of communities kind of coming together to tell the truth so that they could heal, rather than a definitive who's right and who's wrong, and a sentence being carried out, and it's very profound to think that process, while perhaps necessary with the crimes of the Balkan Wars, hasn't necessarily resulted in a more reconciled context now.
If I may just add one thing, I think that in all sides in the Balkan Wars, there was a great denial of what their particular faction had been collectively guilty of, and maybe especially true on the Serbian side, in the sense that the war sort of ended badly, very, very badly for the Serbs as a people. That they were cleansed from Croatia, they were cleansed from large parts of Bosnia which they had occupied, and so there was a huge flow of refugees into Serbia proper. And so, if any Serb is inclined to think, well, history's always weighted against us, they had plenty of evidence to support that idea. I've talked to Bosnian Serbs around in the area of Srebrenica, and they are in complete denial of the fact that in their name, one of the terrible atrocities of post-war Europe was committed. They will construct any number of arguments to show why it was actually the other side did just as bad, or what we did didn't really happen. And if you were trying to construct a process where people were brought face to face with what had been done in their name, somehow, it would have helped tremendously for it to be happening sort of in the region and not in The Hague. There was enormously elaborate intervention in Bosnia and in former Yugoslavia in general after the war, with economic aid, peacekeepers, NGOs, advisors. Rarely has a war been followed by so much intervention. But what there wasn't, I didn't feel, was an attempt to through education or through to bring people face to face with what their own side had actually perpetrated. A lot of that was done kind of off stage in foreign places whose legitimacy could be denied. And that's the one thing I think was missing. And I fear that a lot of old grievances will simply fester on as a result.
Okay, as a journalist, you don't kind of really write about your own personal faith. That's not your job, and it probably wouldn't be the normal habitat to kind of put this kind of conversation where we're discussing foreign correspondent work. But I suppose because my passion is both conflicts in the world, like we've been talking about, but also the dimension of how religious faith and belief can sometimes exacerbate conflicts and make them worse and make them more intractable. And I've seen so many beautiful examples of where faith builds bridges. And just a couple of weeks ago, we lost the former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, whose phrase we use in this podcast: "We're to be guardians of the flame." Your own faith journeys, you were received into the Orthodox Church in 1996.
That's right. Yes, indeed.
I would love to hear a bit about Orthodoxy to kind of bring this interview to a close. Partly because I personally, and I think there's a growing number of kind of, I think people like myself who are kind of coming from a more of an evangelical or Protestant background, who find, as we discover what Orthodoxy teaches, something quite beautiful and something that perhaps has been lacking in our own faith. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? I would love to hear kind of what resonates with you about the tenets of kind of Orthodoxy as a, what is it that it stands on that kind of is so beautiful?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, Providence acts in a mysterious way. I returned from Russia, from full-time residence in Russia in 1993. I set about writing a book about Russia, including quite a lot of Russian history and the transition in Russia. And I found myself studying quite intensely the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I had two separate reactions. And one was that the stance taken towards public events by the church at many times in history, but including the Soviet period, was almost indefensible, and that the leadership of the Russian church in the communist era, as a method of survival, had compromised with Stalin and even fawned on Stalin, it seemed, in a way that was really quite horrifying to somebody from a Western perspective. And then I felt that the church had managed to perpetuate its existence by effectively becoming an arm of Soviet foreign policy and appearing in the World Council of Churches and essentially articulating Soviet foreign policy. And all this, for a Westerner, was very shocking. And yet, something else was going on at the same time. I looked at kind of the existential claims of Orthodoxy. I looked at its doctrines, its teachings, its worship. Now, this happened to be a time of great personal turmoil for me. In the space of 18 months, I lost 3 close people, my brother and 2 close friends, both journalists, actually, both war correspondents who died in the course of duty. So I was undergoing, quite a degree of personal turbulence at the time. And I mean, as I studied the doctrines, the practices, the ethos of the church in itself, as opposed to what public stance its leaders might take, I found it more and more compelling. I found that I felt I was faced with an integrity that could handle disaster, personal tragedy, collective tragedy, that didn't shy away from the brutality of the world. That's Orthodox Christianity in itself, as it were, which I learned to distinguish from the particular stances that might be taken by its hierarchs at particular moments in history. There was a time in January '93 when I went to the States for a research trip, mainly to pursue my investigations of Russian history and to meet white Russian people, emigres in the States, and to talk to Russia experts in the States. On the flight out, I had, as it happens, a Russian priest beside me who didn't speak much else except Russian. He was very grateful to have me to chat to, and that was a pleasant experience. And on the flight back 2 weeks later, who was sitting beside me? But Bishop Kallistos Ware, who's probably the best-known English exponent of the Orthodox faith. So I felt that sort of something. I was getting a message somehow.
Wow. So Kallistos Ware is a remarkable mind and theologian. I know that you wouldn't really want to kind of critique Protestantism or Catholicism or anything, but what is can you kind of pinpoint some certain things, certain kind of real kind of parts of Orthodoxy that you feel stand out as possibly kind of obscured in Protestant or Catholic faith, or parts of it that you find
indeed
so manifestly kind of beautiful?
Well, I felt that in Orthodoxy, I mean, prayer for the departed is very important. And although we are quite agnostic in some ways about the state in which the departed find themselves, we nonetheless find it very important to pray daily for the souls of loved ones who passed on, and to feel that we are part of a community, and that the departed remain connected with our community. That was certainly a very attractive feature. And the whole, the rituals around death, around the funeral services. I mean, Orthodoxy is both very realistic about the fact of physical death. The coffin is usually open, and people line up to give a final embrace to the loved one. So there's no denial of the physical reality of death, and yet there is a very, very powerful affirmation of ultimate resurrection, and of the fact that we pray for the dead because inevitably they'll have sinned, and there's a line that's repeated over and over again because there's no man living who has not sinned. So we pray for the dead person's sins to be forgiven, overlooked, but nonetheless, and we pray for them to be placed in a place of light, where the light of thy countenance shineth, which seems a humane thing to do. I like the combination of realism about the tragedy of physical death, but also hope. And there's a very powerful line in the Orthodox funeral service: "I am the image of God's inexpressible glory, even though I bear the wounds of sin." So you're at once, both on your own behalf and on behalf of the person who's died, you're affirming that we have divinity within us, but we also have sinfulness within us. I remember being absolutely overwhelmed when I read that line first. I am the image of God's inexpressible glory, even though I bear the wounds of sin.
There's a whole lot I think we could really discuss about faith and orthodoxy. Maybe just to kind of ground it in an actual text. We've discussed in the past a particular reading of, for instance, Romans chapter 5.
Yes.
And how reading it in the original Greek, which you read.
Yes,
I asked Bruce once, I remember asking you once, which Bible translation do you prefer? And of course, you said you prefer not to read translations.
Exactly.
You read it in the original Greek, the New Testament in the original Greek. So I'd love to kind of touch on this passage in Romans 5 just briefly, partly because it kind of shows the importance of being able to speak or understand Greek in some form. But it also probably touches on an Orthodox understanding of sin and the world, and for many, like myself, probably growing up more with that kind of Augustinian original sin kind of approach to life. And I think your reading of Romans 5 is probably more true to Orthodoxy, but possibly more true to the Greek.
Yes, I think it's generally true to say that Orthodoxy takes a more charitable, even sort of a somewhat gentler view of human sinfulness. It's not as pessimistic as Augustine was. Orthodoxy regards Augustine as a great teacher of the church. He's known as Blessed Augustine, but as somebody who was also wrong about certain things, including what seems to us his extreme pessimism about the state of the human being, about human sinfulness. And as part of that sort of somewhat more charitable reading of human sinfulness, we do read a particular chapter in the Epistle to the Romans in a different way. Listen, I'll do my best to translate from Greek, and the very last bit can be read in a number of different ways, and explain why. So, translating as I go along from Greek. And therefore, just as through one man sin came into the world, and through sin death, and just as death came to all human beings, and then there's a last four words which take a bit of interpretation, but they seem to mean as a result of which, or through which, all sinned. Now, it's a difficult bit of translation, but in the Western world, the emphasis is on the idea that because Adam sinned, we are therefore all automatically, ipso facto, guilty of sin, that sin is passed down almost genetically from one generation to another, and that we will be held to account for the first sin, the sin committed by Adam. Whereas Orthodoxy would take a more charitable view. It would say that what this verse seems to say, which is that Adam, in a sense, opened the door to sin. He created a world in which sin was a likelihood, a possibility, something we were in perpetual danger of falling into, but that ultimately we will be found responsible not for Adam's sins, but only for our own. And that leads to a particular interpretation of those 4 words at the end of the verse, as a result of which you're all sinned. Now, what the Orthodox reading of that would be that we have all fallen into sin because of the general state of sinfulness and deathfulness that was created by our first ancestors, by Adam, that we're in a world where sinfulness abounds. Death is a kind of permanent reality. There's a kind of deathfulness about fallen creation that tempts us into sin. So as a result of which, the which refers to death. Whereas in Western readings, and this is, I think, sort of confirmed by a particular Latin translation, it's more the idea that because Adam sinned, as a result, that we are automatically found guilty of what he did. Whereas we would say that Adam created a sort of an environment, of sort of a deathful environment that makes it tempting for us to sin, but we are not automatically held responsible for anything except that which we do ourselves.
So it's kind of comparing an idea that sin is kind of passed biologically, genetically down through generations.
Indeed, yes.
To a sense of death being in the world, and our either cooperation with that death or our desire to move against it.
Indeed,
in a more restorative way. To use that word, restorative.
But I could add to that that's probably one reason why, with no disrespect to anybody, the Orthodox Church doesn't have a feast of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. Now, the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, is held in immense honor in the Orthodox Church, as through the very strong belief in the Incarnation, flows an infinite respect for the person who made the Incarnation possible of her own free will. But the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception seems to us to flow from an idea that, in a sense, all acts of natural generation, of all acts of procreation, involve transmitting biologically the sin of Adam from one generation to another. And therefore you have a problem with the Mother of God. If she was such a wonderful person, how can she have been free of sin? Surely, and therefore, you need a doctrine of her Immaculate Conception, and that seems to us unnecessary if you set aside the idea that sin is transmitted biologically.
So the Immaculate Conception being this idea that Mary was conceived without sin.
Indeed,
she was without sin.
Yes.
Well, Bruce, there's so much more we could talk about. Russia, former Yugoslavia, Georgia, Orthodoxy, theology. I'm glad that I live next door and I get to kind of have this ongoing dialogue. And I'm sure anyone watching this, you can comment and ask. Bruce is very good about entering into dialogue. I think that what you've touched on in this interview is fascinating. You've traced a recent history in Europe of great powers falling, of conflicts emerging. You've touched on, I think, quite profoundly in a way that relates to us here in Northern Ireland, is what do we do with the past? What do we do with these memories? How do we remember things in a way that doesn't shame one side or put all the blame on one? And as we've talked about theology, you've just scratched the surface a little bit of maybe a view of God that certainly cares about the dead. And I know when my own father died, who went to Upperlands, our mutual ancestral home. He went there in the 50s, I think, in the first time. I know when he passed away, I did wrestle with what does death mean? Where is he now? It felt so final. He felt so gone. And I did find a lot of I found a lot of consolation in understanding this idea of a great cloud of witnesses, that we are part of a community, both of the living and the dead, and there was something about that that's nourishing and comforting, and you've touched on that, and I think even in that idea of sin in the world. I mean, we live, a lot of what I talk about is conflict. That's death in the world, you know. What do we do about that death? Are we just biologically destined to continue it, or can we imagine a world where conflict gets transformed?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So, Bruce, I want to thank you for giving me your time on this brisk December morning. It's quite cool. It's we've got birds flying around us as we talk. It kind of it's a beautiful scene here in Rostrevor. But thanks for giving me giving us the time, and
really enjoyed it.
It's just brilliant stuff.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it so much. Yes.